These are Logia 60 through 88. This is the authentic part of the Logian, and this is the part that's been added. As in Logia 49 to 53 and 67 to 69, this is a section that has seen extensive Gnostic redaction woven around authentic Devarim. It's likely that the part of the conversation that I have put in bold is authentic. This follows the eating motif, the eater and the eaten, that I have discussed earlier with Logian 8, the wise fisherman, and with Logian 11, the dead are not alive and the living will not die, etc., etc. But like Logian 61, which follows, it's a hybrid saying using part of an authentic Devar quoted to support an attached Gnostic conclusion, in this case a conclusion about the anapasis. Yeshua is saying that true and full integration of the soul into the Bar Anash, as for example in the wise fisherman, cannot happen until after physical death. Paul's opposition to the Corinthian pneumatics, or the so-called perfected souls, and is carried on, or carries on, this idea of Yeshua that the agon is not finished until death. It's not over till the fat lady sings, and it reflects this kind of an understanding. Here we have the authentic and the inauthentic parts. The authentic is in bold. And we have another Logian, a separate Logian. It's definitely a Semitic expression. It contrasts X with Y, and it was misunderstood in New Testament apocalyptic. The appearance of Salome is common in early Gnostic writings because she and Mary Magdalene were considered to be the greatest women disciples of Yeshua. The redactor writes them into the text to establish authority for Gnostic doctrine. Her question to the man Jesus is, "Who are you?" He answers with the Gnostic doctrine about the deity of the eternal Savior. "I am the begotten Son of the eternal Father, and with him I share sovereignty over the all." In other words, in Yeshua's terms, I am Bar Anash. Coptic shesh is from a root meaning equal, same, or something like that. It's a Gnostic term for Godhead as unchanging, often found translated with the incomprehensible divine name, the same. My old Coptic professor Lambden translate this as undivided, but in Gnostic usage it means eternal, unchanging Godhead. In the sense of Greek dysykos, or dysykos, Aramaic se'ef, meaning wavering, doubting, not committed to God's ways, is what we have noted here with footnote 4. Therefore, if I say when one of you is destroyed by death, and that is the Coptic, is destroyed, literally by death, he will be filled with light. But if he is divided, he will be filled with darkness. And that means wavering, or not single-hearted or single-minded. It's not a believing sort of thing. It's a matter of intent and fidelity. In the process of death, a morally and spiritually unrealized person will be lost in fear and ignorance. But a disciple who has realized his moral and spiritual life through good works in life will find joy and enlightenment. Logian 62 seems to be kind of a restatement of the Markan Logian that I translate from an Aramaic perspective to emphasize the original Devar. To you has been given the Ratzim of the Malkuth of God, but for those outside everything comes in Mashalim. In the Tamazian version, the revealer Jesus imparts his secret teachings only to the worthy, that is, members of the Gnostic community. And this implies that the community has received other secret teachings from the risen Christ through revelations given to its leaders. Most of the extant Gnostic writings from Nag Hammadi and other sources, unlike the Gospel of Thomas, consist of long theosophical discourses from the revealer Christ about the origins and foundations and heavenly eons of the all, tapantos, tapan. It is to these that the mysteries of Logian 2a refer. It is to those who are worthy of my mysteries that I tell my mysteries. These are Gnostic mysteries. Logian 62b is not a devar of Yeshua, but the Aramaic expression, do not let your left hand know what your right is doing, is a proverb that Yeshua used. It means keep it to yourself, keep it private. The expression appears only in Matthew's special material in conjunction with almsgiving. Yeshua advised his disciples not to follow the example of the pious observant Pharisees who publicly proclaimed their charity with the shofar. Instead, they should keep it private. He advised the same for prayer. So it is an Aramaic proverb, but it doesn't make any sense here, and the people who put it together didn't make any sense of it. Probably it stood alone. It may have stood alone in the dictation from Aramaic, and then it is to those who are worthy of my mysteries that I tell my mysteries, perhaps was attached for a Gnostic reason. The redactor has changed the Aramaic expression, which by itself is not a devar, into a Coptic Gnostic Logian in its own right by omitting any reference to left or right hand. And that's because in Gnostic thought the left and right had significance in themselves. The Coptic of Logian 62b translates literally, do not let your left know what your right is doing. In the hypostasis of the archons, for example, we find the simplest explanation of left and right. And Sophia, wisdom, took her daughter Zoe, life, and had her sit upon his right to teach him about the things that exist in the eighth, the Agdoas, eighth heaven. And the angel of wrath she placed upon his left. Since that day his right has been called life, and the left has come to represent the unrighteousness of the realm of absolute astrological power above. We can find long, long lists of the angels of the left side of the body and the left side of the universe and the right side, and so on. So this may be an extreme elaboration of the Kabbalistic idea of the good and evil Keizer, the left way and the right way, something like that. Now, if we look at the Apocryphon of John, we get a whole detailed bunch of astrological rulerships of the left and right organs and parts of the human body. And this left and right may have a relationship to the old Deuteronomic way of life and way of death, and the two ways doctrine, and the two Yetzerim, the good and evil Yetzerim, etc. But it's so far removed from Kabbalistic teachings of Yeshua, because it's put into this Valentinian scheme, that it's not authentic with Yeshua. Here, for example, and a voice came forth from the exalted Eon heaven. The man, or mankind, or humanity, Adam, exists, and the Son of Man, Bar Enosh, and the chief archon, Yaldabaoth, the Gnostic demiurge, or creator god of the Old Testament, who mistakenly thought he was the absolute Godhead, heard it and thought that the voice had come from his mother, and he did not know from where it came. And he, the holy and perfect Mother Father, the complete foreknowledge, the image of the invisible one, who is the Father of the all, etc., revealed his likeness in a human form. And he, Yaldabaoth, said to the authorities which attend him, come, let us create a man according to the image of God and according to our likeness, that his image may become a light for us. So this is the idea of the creation of Adam by unfriendly deities, the unfriendly Gnostic deities of this world, the God of the Old Testament. And they created by means of their respective powers in correspondence with the characteristics which were given, and each authority supplied a characteristic in the form of the image which he had seen in its natural form. He created a being according to the likeness of the first perfect man, or Adam. And they said, let us call him Adam, that his name may become a power of light for us. And the powers began. The first one, goodness, created a bone soul. And the second, foreknowledge, created a sinew soul. And the third, divinity, created a flesh soul, etc., etc. Abitrion, the right underarm. Avanthan, the left underarm. Chris, the right hand. Belui, the left hand, etc. The angels are named that contribute to the parts of each of the left and right parts of the body. And the left and right parts of the body are understood in Pythagorean terms. The right is the good or the divine, and the left is the evil. So in both Kabbalistic and Gnostic thought, the human soul is a microcosm of the great macrocosm. The Adam, or primal anthropos, mankind, is the divine image reflected in all human souls. So in Logia 62b, your left is the corrupt part of human nature under the rulership of the unrighteous astrological powers or planets. Plato's motion to the left, possibly also influenced by the Kabbalistic left-hand evil Keizer. Your right is the divine redemptive nature under zodiacal rulership. Plato's motion to the right, possibly influenced by the good or divine Keizer of the Jewish wisdom tradition. So Logia 62b advises the Gnostic to keep the powers that rule his corruptible nature in complete ignorance of the divine powers. That is the way Sophia tricked the evil archons into creating Adam, and the method used to protect Adam and Eve in Valentinian myth. The greatest ally of the Gnostic was his secrecy. Logia 63. This is a group of parables, or mashlim, or mashalim. It's put together for mnemonic reasons because they remind, one of them leads to the next in one's memory. This is not, by the way, an indictment of wealth or rich people are investing money. This is an authentic logging of Yeshua. That's why I've put it in bold. There was a rich man who had great wealth. He said, I shall invest my money so that I may sow, reap, plant, and fill my storehouse with produce, with the result that I shall lack nothing. Such were the thoughts of his heart, but that same night he died. Let him who has ears hear. In fact, we find another parable that rewards the faithful steward who wisely invests his master's wealth. So this is not really an indictment of wealth or of making wealth in an honorable fashion. The dishonorable fashions for making wealth, and the most dishonorable, was in lending money and charging interest to a brother or to another Jew. Rather, this parable is about the impermanence of material riches and the value of spiritual riches. The man follows the impulses of the Yetzer Hara, which mislead him into thinking that he can lack nothing, quote, if he maximizes his personal wealth. In fact, trust in material wealth is lack of true wealth, in other words, spiritual poverty. And this was a teaching of Yeshua. The ironic contrast to the man's intention to create a situation where he lacked nothing is implied in Yeshua's exhortation, let him who has ears hear. The Hebrew Aramaic word for hear also means to understand, comprehend, and obey. In other words, to do it. If somebody just hears you, if your teenage daughter asks you, just hears you say, make her bed, and she doesn't do it, and then in Hebrew you'd say she didn't hear you. The hearer is expected to understand the difference, by the way, between temporal wealth and spiritual wealth. Logia 64 is another parable, one that we're very familiar with. It's a mashal about the banquet. A man had received visitors, and when he prepared his dinner, he sent his servants to invite guests. He went to the first one and said to him, my master invites you. He said, I have claims against some merchants. They're coming to me this evening. I must go and give them my orders. I asked to be excused. And one by one, all the people he invites asked to be excused. So finally, the servant tells this to his master, and the master says, go outside to the streets and bring back whomever you happen to meet so that they may dine. Now, this is repeated in a very uncomprehending way, because this was a parable about a wedding feast, and the people who were invited didn't come, and it was not about a man who had just received visitors. And the wealthy person who's putting it on gets very angry when all of these other people will not come, and so he goes out into the byways and the roads and the villages and everything else and invites all the Amma Haaretz and the beggars and the poor to come share the meal. And this is Yeshua's allegory, his metaphorical allegory about the marriage feast of Messiah. It's about the banquet of Messiah, that all these Pharisees who are part of the ruling class in Jerusalem and who are negative towards John the Baptist and towards the Basor that's being preached, etc., have been invited to the Messianic banquet, but they have refused to come. And so therefore they go out into the byways and the paths and the villages and they preach the Basor to the the villagers and to everybody, and they are invited to this great and wonderful event. Well, here in Thomas, it's been watered down and it's not really quite comprehensible, but it's still authentic. But it adds one thing that makes it very Thomasian. Businessmen and merchants will not enter the places of my Father. This, of course, is the anti-businessman and merchant bias of the Thomasian monks. That is not anything that Yeshua ever said, but it's something that the Gnostic redactor adds to it. And that's the meaning that the Thomasian Gnostic would have gotten out of this. So this is a redaction of the wedding feast mashal from the Q source that appears in both Luke and Matthew. The Kabbalistic Messianic marriage banquet is absolutely crucial to understanding Yeshua's Shabbat Seder. Now, we mentioned that the redactor of Thomas adds his own conclusion because for the Syrian Gnostic monks who were totally negative to the world and the human world, Jesus excluded not only the rich from the kingdom, but all businessmen and merchants. But Yeshua, in fact, offered his inner circle teachings to disciples over a Shabbat or Sabbath meal. And perhaps even in the context of ordinary meals as well, was a form of mystical communion with the heavenly marriage banquet of Messiah, the spiritual, future, or supersubstantial sustenance that we see mentioned in the Lord's Prayer, the epiousion bread. It doesn't mean the daily bread, the pot of beans you're eating in front of you. It means your spiritual sustenance from the future and also mystically present participation in the marriage banquet of Messiah. In fact, Yeshua's meal, his sacred meal, was the historical origin of the Christian Eucharist or Mass. It was not the legendary Last Supper, which appears only in the Synoptics and is not even correctly timed for the Jewish festivals. The Palestinian custom of inviting a huge company of socially distinguished guests to celebrate the marriage of a son is what underlies Yeshua's actual mashal. And when the banquet was done, there was still a huge quantity of food, so it was offered to beggars and the poor of the community who were invited to partake after the guest had left, and that was part of traditional Jewish charity. However, Yeshua's actual mashal that underlies this one in Thomas is an allegory, as we say, of the Messianic banquet to which the pious religious leaders of the Jerusalem temple establishment have been invited but refused in their rejection of the Basor proclaimed by all the prophets up to John the Baptist and Yeshua. Therefore Yeshua, the prophet and servant of God, is sent forth to invite all those whom the Pharisees and Sadducees look down upon, beggars and the Amaha'aretz, or common people and villagers. This is another login that is greatly redacted and spun off from an authentic mashal of Yeshua. Whether this was not part of the original dictation, and whether this is it's probably an accretion from a later material, and most of the material that we have in Matthew that we have other versions of comes from the Q material shared by Matthew and Luke. But then the next largest group, aside from the original material in Thomas that nobody's ever seen, is the material that comes from Matthew, the M material. There's very little that comes from L. It makes us think that the M material may have had access to the same sources as Thomas. Here's the reconstruction of the original mashal. There was a master who owned a vineyard. He leased it to tenant farmers so they could work it, and he would collect part of the produce from them. But when he sent his servants so that the tenants might give him produce of the vineyard, they seized him and beat him. The servant went back and told his master. The master sent another servant. The tenants beat this one as well. Then the master sent another servant, and this time they killed him. What then will the master of the vineyard do? He will come and kill those tenants and give the vineyard to others. Let him who has ears hear. This is, of course, a mashal directed against the Jerusalem religious establishment, those who controlled the wealthy people who controlled the temple and were collaborators with the Romans. And the servants are the prophets. And this doesn't refer specifically to Yeshua being killed, although Yeshua was probably aware that he would eventually be executed. But in the parable in Thomas, it says that then he sent his own son. Now that's what we find said in the Christian version of this parable that we find in the New Testament. And they killed a son, and so who was heir to the vineyard, etc. So this is probably taken from Christian material, and it's not regular part of the original dictation. So Yeshua's denunciation of the Judean Pharisaic establishment was overt and in-your-face stuff. But to prophesy against the temple establishment, like the Sadducees especially, was dangerous, as they were allied with the Herodians, who executed John the Baptist and were looking for a legal reason to execute Yeshua. So his prophecies against the temple were done as allegorical mashlim, parables. In the original Devar, the final prophet who was killed by the tenants would probably brought the execution of John the Baptist to mind, since he was opposed by the Pharisees and the Sadducees of the Jerusalem religious establishment and had recently been decapitated by Herod. Yeshua's conclusion that the master will kill the unworthy tenants and turn his vineyard over to others was one of his prophecies against the Jerusalem temple establishment. When it was fulfilled in the year 70 of the Common Era, the Gentile churches interpreted this to mean that they were God's new Israel and that the blood of Jesus was the sacrificial seal for a new covenant. The Old Covenant, or Testament, had been taken away from the Jews and given to the Christian churches, and this became the rubric in the canon for interpreting all of Yeshua's woe prophecies against the Jewish religious establishment. And it guided the way all of his Davarim and Mashalim were to be redacted in the Gospels of the New Testament. So that's what gives us what we call the anti-Semitic slant and spin that you find in all the New Testament Gospels. That Yeshua's prophecies against the Jerusalem religious establishment become prophecies against the Jews wholesale. So this anti-Jewish spin is something that is really responsible for justifying many atrocities against Jews in medieval Europe. And certainly the anti-Semitism of the ancient world was a very different thing than the anti-Semitism of the Christian world, and that in itself was a different form of anti-Semitism than what we found in the 19th and 20th century, starting with people like Richard Wagner and his wife, who was quite a terrible person, and the anti-Semitism that became part of the Nazi and Marxian doctrines. Very different kind of anti-Semitism, not based in the Jews being Christ killers, but in the Jews being the ones who had the power to loan money and developed, became landlords and so on, and so they were the bad guys. Logian 66, show me the stone which the builders have rejected. That one is the capstone. The capstone, Rosh Phena, the chief stone, apex stone, or top stone, not the cornerstone. The cornerstone was the first one placed in the foundation of a new structure, usually the northeast corner. It had to be stronger and larger than the others. It was also called the foundation stone. It was often inscribed with a date and the patron or other dedication, including Masonic markings, as you have in a Mark Mason. The capstone, by contrast, was the last stone placed. It signified the completion of a building project, and it too could be inscribed. Here's a capstone recovered from a synagogue at Capernaum, the synagogue where Peter would have worshipped. Peter was the name given by Yeshua. Kephas meant rock, stone. Petros became Petros in Greek. We know him as Peter, but his name was Shimon, Simon. The Hebrew word for capstone also describes the pinnacle of Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, where, according to the early Christian Haggadah about the temptation of Jesus, he was transported and seated by Shaitan. Psalm 118, the stone the builders rejected has become the capstone. The Lord has done this, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Yeshua is quoting directly and very consciously from this capstone psalm. So he probably repeated this many times as a proverb that to remind his listeners of what was said in Scripture, to satirize the incompetence of the Jerusalem temple establishment. And Yeshua, in fact, was trained as a stonemason, it seems, and so not a carpenter. And so this would have had a special significance to him. The metaphorical significance of a capstone rejected by builders hired by the Sadducees was something like that of the pious Pharisees who strained gnats from their soup to avoid breaking kosher rules, but, quote, swallowed a camel whose meat was considered to be far more unclean. The capstone, a beautiful capstone that should adorn the top of a building, is in other words the produce and the fruit of many, many years of Kabbalistic understanding and Midrashic interpretation that came out of the Pharisaic movement, is now being rejected by the Pharisees, and that's the messianic message that Yeshua was preaching and others preached in many places. So the meaning here is that the Jerusalem temple establishment had neglected the basic and essential foundations of religion to construct their own religious house of cards, and that they had rejected the great fruits and that had evolved from the work of many, many, many hundreds of years of Pharisaic understanding in the wisdom schools and in the Merkaba mysticism and so on, that Yeshua knew, but was now being rejected. Logia 67, whoever knows the all, tapan, but lacks within himself, lacks the all. Now the all is a Greek term. It's not something you find in Aramaic. It means the universe. It means not only the visible, but the invisible cosmos, including the pleroma of the eons to the Gnostics. The term lack relates to Yeshua's teachings about spiritual wealth, those who have, as opposed to bondage to material wealth, which is spiritual poverty, those who lack. But in Gnostic terms, it refers specifically to lacking gnosis, the spiritual self-knowledge that was paradoxically gained through hearing Gnostic doctrine. The funny paradox about gnosis that is said by people of any sensibility is the gnosis can be learned, but it cannot be taught. And yet the Gnostics tried to teach it all the time. The gnosis is the manda. It's the inner teachings, the inner meaning of Scripture and so on. But to the Gnostics, it was the doctrine that could be taught, just like to the Christians. Faith was something to be believed and codified in creeds, rather than fidelity and faithfulness. Now, Coptic scholars have translated this saying in several ways. Lambden attempts a psychological interpretation. He says, if one who knows the all still feels a personal deficiency, he is completely deficient. Patterson, in Robinson's edition, says, whoever knows all, if he is lacking one thing, he is already lacking everything. Blatz comes closer to a literal interpretation. He who knows the all but fails to know himself misses everything. And Grondin's literal translation that's available on the internet, he who knows the all, if he needs himself, needs the place, all of it, is not too helpful. To the Gnostic, it meant that even if a person were to have all knowledge of the cosmos, all the esoteric knowledge of everything, if he lacked the interior gnosis of his own divine nature, he would lack everything that is real, what the Hermetics call ta'anta, the things that are really real. True philosophical gnosis, as I said, cannot be taught. It could only be learned. So here's Grandin's literal translation from Coptic. It's not always correct, but you might find it to be useful for you in your studies. Logia 68 and 69 we're considering together. These are a series of separate Gnostic Beatitudes. Logian 68a is based on a later church expansion of the Beatitude of Yeshua in Matthew 5:10. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for the milk of heaven belongs to them. Now Matthew has created this. He's expanded upon this in view of persecution against the early Christian churches. And in the next verse he says, blessed are you, meaning the persecuted Christian, when men shall revile you and persecute you and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Now Thomas in Logian A seems to have developed from Matthew's expansion and was probably interpreted as persecution against the Syrian Gnostic communities. In any case, it's not an authentic beatitude. Now 68b is a Gnostic beatitude, probably developed from Yeshua's instruction to missionary disciples to ritually shake the dust off their sandals, quote, for a testimony against the villages who did not receive the Basor. By the way, that was not for a testimony against the villages. It appears that way in the Christian Gospels because it's an anti-Semitic statement implying that these are all people who rejected their own Christ. But the shaking the dust off the sandals was not a testimony against the people. It was a way of ritual purification on a sacred journey, and I'll show you that in another Logian. Now this this Logian 68b, wherever you've been persecuted, they will find no place in heaven. That is, they will find no tapas, is the Greek word. It promises that wherever the Syrian Gnostic preachers have been rejected, the villagers will not have a heavenly tapas or abode in the anapasis after death. Here's another one, a beatitude. It's a Gnostic beatitude. Blessed are they who have suffered internally. And the intent of this and the meaning of this is have purposely caused themselves to suffer, so to speak. It's they who truly come to know the Father. And blessed are the hungry, for the belly of him who desires will be filled. Now, Logian 69a is a beatitude for those who have adopted not only external asceticism, but the practice of harsh self-examination, continual self-recrimination for their sins. Those who have suffered internally, probably developed from Logian 58 about the man of affliction. Yeshua made self-examination of motives and meaning discrimination between the impulses of good and evil Yetzerim fundamental to his halakha, but it was not a joyless self-recrimination as developed in both Gnostic and Christian monastic traditions. Rather, it was more like the Buddhist mindfulness discipline of being fully present and aware in the moment. But to the Gnostic ascetic, self-deprivation and internal suffering were the virtues that drew him upward in consciousness and gnosis to the Father. The beatitude of Logian 69b seems almost identical to the Q Logian quoted by both Matthew and Luke in their Sermons on the Mount and Sermon on the Plain. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you will be filled. But the Coptic idiom is far more specific than the Aramaic saying, and it's reflected in Greek Q, because the Greek and underlying Aramaic hunger and be filled can be a simile for having a great desire for righteousness, as in Matthew 5:6, blessed are they who hunger and thirst after righteousness. But the Coptic of Thomas is speaking literally of physical hunger being satisfied, the belly of him who desires. Specifically by filling the belly, this probably had a literal meaning to an ascetic Gnostic who considered fasting from food to bring spiritual merit in itself. When you beget that one you have within your hearts, he will perfect you. If you do not bring forth that one within your hearts, what you have not brought forth within your hearts will kill you. Now the Coptic verb of the first clause is jepo, which means to beget or bring to birth. It's not just when you bring forth that which is within you. It's when you bring to birth. And that's consistent with Yeshua's inner circle teachings about the birth from above. The Coptic phrase meaning inside or within derives from the Aramaic idiom within the heart. That's also the Greek entos. The kingdom of heaven is within you. Entos, inside of you, is from the Aramaic within your heart. The heart was the abode of the Kabbalistic image, or Yetzer, or Zelam of God, as well as the evil Yetzer Hara, which was not real, but like a shadow lacking reality. Nevertheless, like a weed, it had the power to choke out the divine seed that could become a tree of life if carefully germinated and nurtured. Coptic pe specifies that one, and I've capitalized that one. I've capitalized one to clarify its meaning. It's the Bar Enosh, the Pauline second Adam, or Christ, that must be begotten in the heart. It is the Zelam, or which produces the Yetzer HaTov. It's a Kabbalistic divine spark that has the power to transform self and the human world and rule in the Malkuth, or sovereignty, at the right hand of Godhead as the heavenly Son of mankind. So Logia 70 tells us, if you beget that one in the heart, he will perfect you. The Coptic verb is tuje, which occurs only once in the sayings of Thomas, but represents the Aramaic verb shalom, to be whole, perfect, complete, finished. To become shalem, or spiritually perfected, was the goal of Yeshua's halakha. It's incorrectly translated by many scholars, just coming from the Coptic, as he or she or it will save you. The word does not mean save. The next clause, if you do not bring forth that one, does not repeat the Coptic word for begetting. Rather, it's the acmimic form te, a very general verb meaning everything from give and bring and pay and go forward and lay upon and fight with and pursue. I use the phrase bring forth, but it has the sense of interact with, struggle with, and perhaps best something like develop or increase. If you do not pay heed to and honor that one, then what you have failed to bring forth in your hearts will spiritually kill you. So this is consistent with Yeshua's davarim, such as those who have, to those who have, more will be given, but to those who lack or have not, even what they have will be taken away. Logia 71, I shall destroy this house and no one will be able to build it again. It seems to be rooted in a Christian redaction of an independent version of Yeshua's davar, predicting the destruction of the Second Temple of Solomon that Herod had co-opted and glorified with Roman architecture. Now, Yeshua did not say that he would destroy the temple. He predicted its destruction. He also predicted God's destruction of the house or ruling establishment of the Jerusalem temple. It's unlikely that Yeshua proclaimed himself as the destroyer of the temple. He probably said something like, the Father will destroy the temple and its rulers will be destroyed, or possibly the Son of mankind or the Bar Enosh will destroy. In Christian memory, that would have been tantamount to saying, I shall destroy. By way of contrast, in Johannine tradition, the temple destruction motif was reinterpreted as a prophecy of Yeshua's resurrection. Jesus answered and said unto them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Then said the Jews, 46 years was this temple in building, and wilt thou rear it up in 3 days? But he spake of the temple of his body. When therefore he was risen from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this unto them, and they believed the scripture and the word which Jesus had said. Now the disciples' memoirs or remembrances differed among themselves, but they were the origin of what was preserved as the teaching of Yeshua in writing. Peter's remembrances lie at the root of Mark's gospel, those of other apostles at the root of Q, and possibly those of Thomas at the root of the Gospel of Thomas. They are remembered differently, but by examining the similarities among them and taking account of bias and spin, Peter was married, Thomas was not, etc., we can reconstruct many of them with reasonable certainty. As the Logian stands in Thomas, it's not authentic. but it is based on something that is authentic, probably taken from Scripture. Logia 72, a man said to him, "Tell my brothers to divide my father's possessions with me." He said to them, "O man, who has made me a divider?" He turned to his disciples and said to them, "I'm not a divider, am I?" This is a late Gnostic composition based on a story in Luke. This is one of the this may be the only special Lucan material we really have here in Thomas. Most of it comes from special Matthean material, the M material. So it's a pericope, or an account of an event, not a prophetic devar. In Thomas, it functions almost as a Gnostic inside joke. The revealer, Jesus, teaches interior unity, not division, a Gnostic philosophical term for duality. Thus, I am not a divider, am I? The phrase, "O man," is used extensively by Paul and in other Greek translations of prophetic literature, but it does not constitute an Aramaic idiom. It's rather a self-conscious literary idiom found in Greek translations. So this is redacted from Luke's special material in chapter 12, the only source for a similar pericope. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Friend, who set me to be a judge or arbitrator over you? And he said to them, "Take care, be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." And of course, the point of that saying is that his job is not to be one who makes decisions about material possessions. So in the historical teachings of Yeshua, he, like all the prophets, saw himself as a divider, not a unifier. Many of his sayings are, "I come to bring fire," and "I come to bring division," etc. He had no illusions about the fact that his message would be ill-received and would be controversial. Logia 73, the harvest is great, but the laborers are few. Beseech the Lord, therefore, to send out laborers to the harvest. Well, Yeshua compared his mebazrim, or proclaimers of the Basar, we call them apostles, to fishermen and to workers in a harvest. The latter, which was his most common metaphor, implies that God, the master or owner of the harvest, had other workers to prepare, plant, and cultivate his fields. The work of these apostles was specifically to harvest the ripened crop of human souls. And implicit in the saying, in which Yeshua exhorts his hearers to pray that God will send more harvesters, is the concept that each of the mebazrim has been sent to Yeshua by God. And this is vital for an understanding the New Testament stories about Jesus calling forth and choosing his disciples, and sometimes even calling forth people out of a crowd of hearers and bringing them into a very high status, because he would perceive or see in them a great deal of preparation, even more than in his current disciples, and that could cause jealousy. A conventional Rav in Yeshua's day did not solicit disciples, nor did he preach publicly. He taught his own circle from his home or a synagogue. A potential Talmud or disciple came to him and sought permission for access. All disciples were male, they were men. They applied and he accepted or rejected. By contrast, Yeshua publicly called people to submit to divine sovereignty and follow his halakha. "Follow me, halkeni," he said. He did not remain secluded. And the follow me was literally halkeni, follow my halakha, walk my walk. He did not remain secluded and inaccessible in one place, but journeyed by foot through Palestine, proclaiming the Basar. He psychically recognized the signs of a Talmud, whom he called out of a crowd of hearers, and of course he accepted women disciples, or Talmidot, a word that didn't even exist in Aramaic, because there was no such thing as women disciples. Like John the Baptist, he publicly proclaimed the Basar, but he also gave halakhic teachings in public, although usually as mashlims, parable, and davarim, prophetic utterances. Mashlim and davarim were his allegorical way of putting out to see who the hearers were, who were the people that could understand. Now, John's teachings were apparently based solely on messianic and eschatological prophecy. John was an apocalypticist. Yeshua was not. I know of no evidence that John the Baptist psychically recognized and called disciples, or that he accepted women disciples. He was also inaccessible, except when he staged a large public mikvah on the Jordan River. Yeshua continued John's baptism, but otherwise he was very much his own man, and he was accessible, very accessible. Logia 74 and 75. O Lord, there are many around the drinking trough, but there is nothing in the well. Here we have a picture of a big empty cistern. People are walking around in it because it's dry. To this has been added, many are standing at the door, but it is the solitary monk who will enter the bridal chamber. Now that, of course, is not authentic. In Logia 74, Yeshua himself speaks to Adonai and observes that there are many people seeking true spiritual teaching, which he compares to water, through their synagogues and rabbis, but the well of established religion has gone dry. Logia 74 has a clear mnemonic connection to Logia 73 through prayer to Adonai to send harvesters, and is probably part of the original Aramaic dictation. Logia 75 is an expansion of 74 based on a Gnostic interpretation of it. This is obvious from reference to the Gnostic bridal chamber, which is not the same thing as the Kabbalistic bride chamber. To the Gnostics, those standing around the dry well were probably the proto-Orthodox Christians of the 2nd century who lacked the true gnosis. Logia 75 expands upon the dry well by observing that many are standing at the door, i.e. the Christians, but it will be the monk, the solitary, who will enter the bridal chamber. That also implies that the bridal chamber was a sacrament for the Tomasians, just as it was for those who later wrote the Gospel of Philip.